Southwick House was quiet, but it never felt at rest. Lamps glowed over long tables filled with maps of northern France. Pins marked beaches, villages, roads that most of the men in the room would never see again once the operation began. Cigarette smoke lingered under the ceiling, trapped with a tension that refused to leave. Omar Bradley stood alone at the center table. His hands moved slowly across the map of Normandy, following the coastline, stopping at Omaha, then drifting inland. He erased a line he had drawn minutes earlier and replaced it with another, almost identical. The difference was small. The consequence would not be. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows. The sound kept time with the ticking clock on the wall. Bradley had spent his career believing in preparation. He trusted disciplined logistics and quiet competence more than speeches or bravado. He was not known for dramatic gestures. He was known for responsibility, and that weight pressed on him now more heavily than any medal ever had. The invasion plan demanded precision that bordered on faith. Weather, tides, airdrops, naval bombardment, ground movement, each element depended on the others behaving exactly as predicted. Any delay on the beaches would echo inland. Any confusion at the shoreline would multiply by the hour. Bradley's eyes settled on Omaha Beach. The terrain looked unforgiving even on paper. Narrow sand, steep bluffs, defensive positions placed with care and patience by an enemy who had been waiting for this day just as long. The men who would land there would have seconds to move or die. There would be no room for correction once the ramps dropped. He stepped back from the table and looked around the room. Coffee cups sat untouched. Chairs were pulled back and abandoned. Everyone was waiting, somewhere else, for a decision that could not be rehearsed. Earlier that day, Bradley had walked the English coast. He had watched soldiers line up beside landing craft, packs heavy, faces quiet. Some talked, some laughed. Most stared straight ahead, as if looking too closely at the future might make it arrive sooner. He had knelt in the sand and drawn a simple shape with a piece of driftwood, a slope, a rise, a line of fire. He had watched a young soldier nod, as if understanding could make the moment easier. When it finally came, Bradley knew better. Understanding did not soften impact. It only made it real. Back at Southwick House, the briefings repeated the same assurances. Naval guns would suppress the defenses. Air strikes would weaken resistance. Airborne troops would secure the exits. Each statement was correct on its own. Together, they formed a structure that could hold or collapse, depending on factors no one could fully control. The weather reports were the most unforgiving. Winds shifting, seas rising. A narrow window of calmer conditions, measured in hours, not days. If the invasion moved forward, it would move forward inside that window. If it slipped, the opportunity might vanish entirely. Bradley understood what delay meant. Every postponed hour allowed the enemy to strengthen positions, adjust defenses, prepare for exactly what was coming. Momentum mattered. Surprise mattered. Speed mattered. So did lives. In the conference room that night, the debate stayed measured, but the stakes were unmistakable. Some argued that waiting invited disaster. Others believed that forcing the assault under imperfect conditions risked something worse. Bradley did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His concern was steady, grounded, and impossible to dismiss. He believed the plan was strong. He also believed it asked everything of the first wave and offered them very little margin for error. When the discussion ended, nothing was settled. Decisions were deferred. Another meeting scheduled. Another night to think. Bradley returned to his quarters long after midnight. The room was small, practical, almost bare. On the desk lay casualty estimates, numbers typed neatly onto pages that tried and failed to look neutral. He closed the folder without reading it again. He sat on the edge of the cot, hands resting on his knees, listening to the distant sound of aircraft engines warming on nearby fields. Somewhere, paratroopers were boarding planes. Somewhere, sailors were checking lines and engines. Somewhere, men were writing letters they would not be able to send. Bradley knew that history would not record hesitation kindly. It rarely did. But he also knew that history did not carry rifles onto a beach. By the time he turned off the light, one question remained unresolved. pressing harder than all the others. Not whether the invasion could succeed, but whether it was truly ready to begin. Morning arrived without relief. The sky remained low and heavy, clouds moving fast enough to remind everyone how little control they truly had. The sea beyond the cliffs was darker than it had been the day before, restless, uncooperative. Bradley stood near the edge of the ground at Southwick House, coat pulled tight, watching flags strain against their lines. Wind mattered now. Every knot of speed altered drop zones, landing angles, timing. Numbers on a chart turned into drift, scatter, separation. Inside, the headquarters came back to life. Footsteps echoed through corridors. Doors opened and closed. Messages moved hand to hand, each one adding pressure rather than clarity. The updated weather briefing confirmed what Bradley already felt. Conditions were not improving. They were barely holding. The margin for error narrowed. Reports arrived from naval commanders. Rough seas would complicate the approach. Landing craft would struggle to hold formation. Some would arrive late. Some would not arrive where planned. Men would step into deeper water than expected, weighed down by gear designed for a different scenario. Bradley listened without interruption. He asked for specifics. How high were the waves? How strong the crosswinds? How much deviation could be absorbed before the plan began to fracture? No one could give answers with confidence. Maps were adjusted again. Timetables refined. Contingencies stacked on top of contingencies until the simplicity of the original plan felt distant, almost naive. As the hours passed, Bradley moved between rooms, absorbing fragments of the operation from every angle. Airborne units reported ready, though the wind threatened to scatter them across miles of countryside. Naval officers spoke of fire support schedules that depended on visibility that might not exist. Ground commanders emphasized training and morale. The only constants left, outside the headquarters, the buildup continued. Trucks rolled by in steady lines. Soldiers waited, checked weapons, smoked cigarettes they barely tasted. The scale of it all was impossible to ignore. Too large to stop easily. Too large to fail quietly. Bradley returned again and again to the beaches. Omaha remained the center of his concern. Intelligence updates suggested stronger defenses than originally estimated. More obstacles. Better fields of fire. Positions carved into terrain that favored the defender in every way. The men assigned would have no shelter, no high ground, no easy retreat. Only forward movement offered survival. In the command room, discussions grew shorter. There was less debate now, more calculation. The question had shifted from whether the conditions were ideal to whether they were acceptable. The distinction mattered, but it was also dangerous. Acceptable could become inevitable without anyone meaning it to. Bradley requested revised casualty projections under current conditions. The numbers increased, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed, enough to change what the beaches might look like by midday. He said nothing when the figures were placed in front of him. He folded the paper once and set it aside. Throughout the day, he felt the operation pulling forward under its own weight. Men had been gathered from across continents. Equipment loaded. Schedules locked. Delaying now would not simply pause the machine. It would strain it. Morale would suffer. Secrecy would weaken. Another delay after that might break something no plan could fix. Yet the alternative pressed just as hard. By afternoon, Eisenhower convened another session. The atmosphere was different, less theoretical, more final. Faces showed fatigue, not doubt, but the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a decision too long. The weather officers spoke again. A narrow break. Still there, still fragile. Bradley watched Eisenhower closely. He saw the weight settle deeper into the Supreme Commander's posture. Leadership did not eliminate uncertainty. It absorbed it. Bradley understood that whatever choice was made, it would belong to Eisenhower alone in the history books. But he also knew his own responsibility. Silence could be interpreted as agreement. Agreement could become complicity. When he spoke, his words were measured. He did not argue against the invasion. He did not suggest abandoning the plan. He focused on readiness, on alignment between expectation and reality. He made clear that bravery could not compensate for physics, terrain, or weather. The room listened. No one accused him of fear. No one dismissed his concerns. They simply weighed them against everything else that was already in motion. As evening approached, the final signals began to prepare. Orders drafted but not yet sent. Aircraft fueled. Ships adjusted position. The invasion hovered in a suspended state, balanced between commitment and restraint. Bradley stepped outside as dusk settled. The wind had not eased. The sky showed no sign of clearing. He watched the horizon, knowing that beyond it lay a coastline filled with bunkers, mines, and men who would defend it without hesitation. Somewhere behind him, engines started again. The situation was no longer theoretical. Time was forcing the answer. Night returned with the same uneasy rhythm. Wind against windows. Engines in the distance. The quiet movement of staff who spoke less now, as if words themselves might disturb the balance. Bradley remained awake. He sat once more before the maps, but this time he did not redraw lines. He studied what was already there. Beaches labeled in code. Arrows pointing inland. Assumptions frozen into ink. The plan looked decisive, confident, almost inevitable. It did not show hesitation. It did not show doubt. It did not show the cost. He thought of the men again, not in formations, not in units, but individually. The way they adjusted straps before boarding. The way they avoided looking at the sea for too long. The way experience had taught them to focus on small tasks when the larger picture became too heavy. Bradley had never believed that war required emotional distance. He believed it required control. The discipline to act without illusion. The courage to question momentum when momentum became dangerous. He stood and walked to the window. The grounds of Southwick House were dim, lit only in narrow pools. Vehicles moved slowly, deliberately. Everything was ready. Everything was waiting. Readiness, he knew, was not a single moment. It was alignment, weather, timing, coordination, human endurance. When those elements aligned, action followed. When they did not, action became gamble. The wind had not changed. Inside the headquarters, messages continued to arrive. Airborne commanders acknowledged the risk of scattered drops. Naval officers confirmed they could still execute the bombardment, though accuracy would suffer. Ground units reported no change in status. They would go when ordered. They always would. Bradley reviewed the sequence again in his mind. The hours before dawn. The aircraft crossing the coast. The first shells landing. The landing craft forming lines in heavy water. The ramps dropping into smoke and confusion. The first decisions made under fire, by men who would have seconds to adapt. He understood that no invasion of this scale would ever feel fully ready. Doubt was not proof of weakness. It was proof of awareness. Still, doubt had to end somewhere. Shortly before midnight, Eisenhower called for another meeting. Smaller this time. Fewer voices. The air carried a finality that had been missing before. The weather officers spoke first. The break was still forecast. Narrow, unreliable, but present. Silence followed. Bradley felt the moment arrive before it was announced. The moment when questioning turned into choosing. When caution either reshaped the plan or stepped aside. He spoke without urgency. He did not restate every concern. He focused on one truth, that if the invasion went forward, it would do so under conditions that reduced control at the critical first contact, that the men on the beaches would pay for every variable that could not be managed from a map room. He made no recommendation for delay. He made no demand to proceed. He placed reality on the table and let it remain there. Eisenhower listened. He did not interrupt. When Bradley finished, the room stayed quiet. At last, Eisenhower nodded. The meeting ended without ceremony. Orders were not yet given, but the direction was clear. The machine had reached a point where stopping might cause as much damage as letting it run. Bradley left the room and walked the corridors one final time. Staff officers moved with purpose now. Messages were being finalized. Signals prepared. The invasion was transitioning from possibility to action. He paused near a doorway and watched a young officer carefully fold a map, hand steady, face pale. Bradley recognized the look. It was not fear. It was focus sharpened by consequence. Outside, transport aircraft began to line up for departure. One by one, they rolled forward, engines rising, then lifting into the dark. Each plane carried men who would be on French soil before dawn, scattered by wind, finding their way in darkness with little more than training and instinct. Bradley stood still and watched until the lights vanished. In that moment, the question changed. It was no longer whether the invasion was ready. It was whether the responsibility of doubt had been fully honored before action replaced it. Bradley turned back toward the headquarters. There was nothing left to adjust. Only the outcome remained. The final orders moved through the headquarters just after midnight. Quiet confirmations, short acknowledgments, no speeches, no hesitation left to express. The invasion was on. Bradley stood in the operations room as the first reports came in. Aircraft had crossed the coast. Navigation lights blinked once, then disappeared into cloud and darkness. Radios crackled with fragmented transmissions, some clear, some already distorted by distance and weather. The airborne drops began. Almost immediately, the reports fractured, units landing off course, stick leaders missing, men scattered across fields and hedgerows instead of designated zones. The words came carefully, professionally, but their meaning was unmistakable. Control was slipping earlier than planned. Bradley said nothing. He moved closer to the map, watching markers shift as staff updated positions. The precision of the plan dissolved into approximation, estimated locations, probable contacts, unconfirmed successes. Naval reports followed, seas rougher than forecast, landing craft struggling to maintain formation, some turning back, some pushing forward out of alignment. Timetables began to stretch. Dawn approached. As first light crept across the channel, the naval bombardment commenced. Guns fired on schedule, shells arcing toward the coast. Observers reported impacts, but visibility remained poor. Smoke and mist blended into a single gray wall. Bradley focused on Omaha. The first wave was minutes out. He watched the clock. Each second carried weight. The room grew still as reports narrowed to the beaches. Utah showed early signs of deviation, landings pushed south by current, but resistance appeared lighter. Adjustments were already being made on the ground. Then Omaha spoke. The initial messages were sparse, then delayed, then urgent. Landing craft hit obstacles. Men disembarking into deep water. Equipment sinking. Units mixing before reaching the sand. Naval fire lifting, sometimes too early, sometimes too late. German positions were still active. The bluffs were alive. Bradley felt the room tighten around those words. He leaned forward, one hand on the table, eyes fixed on the map as if proximity might grant influence. Casualty reports began to form, incomplete but unmistakable. Companies pinned down, progress measured in yards, not objectives. Officers down, radios lost, smoke thickening instead of clearing. This was the moment Bradley had feared most, the point where momentum could break completely. He issued no dramatic orders. There were none that could rewrite the opening minutes. Authority now rested with junior officers, with sergeants, with men making choices under fire that would never be recorded in full. The minutes stretched. Then fragments of progress appeared. A gap opened near a draw. A small group reached the base of the bluffs. Naval guns adjusted fire closer to shore, risking friendly positions to suppress enemy guns. The reports were uneven, contradictory, but alive. Bradley exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. By mid-morning, Omaha was still contested, still costly, but no longer static. Movement existed. Forward motion, however slow, had begun. Bradley straightened and stepped back from the table. He removed his glasses and wiped them with a cloth, hands steady despite the strain settling into his posture. The question of readiness no longer mattered. The invasion had answered it in blood. Bradley remained in the room as the day unfolded. He absorbed updates from every sector, measuring success not in territory gained but in collapse avoided. The beachhead held. Barely, but it held. Outside, the sky cleared slightly, just enough to let light through. By afternoon, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The cost was severe, the toll undeniable, but the foothold existed. The door, once forced open, would not close again. Bradley looked once more at Omaha on the map. The red markings had shifted inland, almost imperceptibly. It was enough. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Evening settled slowly over Southwick House. The light faded, but the rooms remained alive with motion. Reports continued to arrive, steadier now, less urgent in tone, though no less heavy in meaning. Bradley sat at the edge of the operations room, no longer standing over the map. Others had taken that position. The battle had moved beyond lines and symbols. It lived now on the ground, in places the maps could only approximate. Omaha still demanded attention. Casualties continued to rise as resistance collapsed in pockets rather than all at once. Progress was uneven, but irreversible. The beach that had nearly broken the assault now held a fragile rhythm of movement inland. Bradley listened. He did not interrupt. He did not correct. His role had shifted from shaping the opening to sustaining what followed. The question that had haunted him for days did not return. Readiness had revealed itself not as certainty, but as endurance, the ability to absorb chaos without losing direction, the willingness of men to continue forward when the plan dissolved around them. As night approached, Bradley stepped outside. The wind had eased. The sky had opened just enough to show breaks in the cloud cover. The channel lay dark and wide, hiding the movement of ships that still crossed back and forth, carrying supplies, wounded, replacements. He stood alone, hands clasped behind his back. There would be no celebration. Not tonight. The cost was too visible, even from across the water. The names would come later. The numbers would grow. History would compress the day into a sentence. Few would remember how close it had come to failing in its first hours. Bradley turned back toward the building. Inside, the work continued without pause. There would be no rest. Not yet. He paused once more at the doorway. Glancing back toward the coast, he could not see. The beaches were no longer just objectives. They were graves, corridors, beginnings. The invasion was no longer a question. It was a responsibility that had been accepted, tested, and carried forward. Bradley walked inside and closed the door behind him. The war had entered a new phase, and there was no turning back.